The question came on a Tuesday afternoon at a rest stop off Interstate 40, whispered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 9 years old, his voice barely audible over the rumble of idling semi-trucks and the hiss of air brakes. "Mister, will you be my dad for just one day?" Most men would have walked away. But Jackson, Ironwood, Reeves wasn't most men, and the way the kid's fingers trembled while clutching a crumpled flyer made something crack open in the massive biker's chest that he'd kept sealed shut for nearly 15 years. But that moment was still 3 hours away. The morning had started like 100 others before it, with Ironwood rolling his Harley out of a roadside motel in eastern New Mexico just after dawn, the desert air still cool enough to sting his face through his beard. He was 6 feet 4 inches and built like a man who'd spent decades working with his hands, his leather vest carrying the patches of the Hells Angels Nomad chapter, the worn fabric creaking slightly as he stretched beside his bike. He'd been riding alone for 6 days now, heading nowhere in particular the way he always did when the memories got too heavy. The kind of memories that lived in the space between sleep and waking, reminding him of a daughter's laugh he'd never hear again, a kindergarten graduation he'd missed because he'd been locked up 3 states away, a phone call from his ex-wife telling him not to bother coming to the funeral because he'd already been absent for everything that mattered. 15 years hadn't made those memories any lighter. The rest stop appeared around noon, a concrete island in an ocean of scrub, brush, and highway, the kind of place where truckers caught a few hours of sleep and families stretched their legs before the next 300 miles. Ironwood pulled in only because his tank was running low and his back needed a break from the vibration of the road. He parked near the edge of the lot, away from the minivans and sedans, and walked toward the vending machines with the slow, deliberate gait of a man whose presence made people step aside without thinking about it. That's when he saw the boy. The kid sat alone on a concrete bench near the dog walking area, wearing jeans 2 sizes too big and a t-shirt that had been washed so many times the design had faded to nothing. His sneakers were held together with duct tape, and his hair looked like it had been cut at home with dull scissors. But what caught Ironwood's attention wasn't the poverty written across the child's appearance. It was the way the boy kept glancing toward the parking lot, then down at something in his hands, then back toward the lot again, his small face tight with worry that looked far too old for someone so young. Ironwood bought a coffee from the machine and told himself to mind his own business. But when he walked back toward his bike, the boy was standing now, pacing in small circles, and Ironwood could see what he was holding. A blue flyer, creased and wrinkled like it had been folded and unfolded dozens of times. The kid noticed him watching and froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the boy did something Ironwood hadn't expected. He walked straight toward the massive biker, his steps hesitant but determined, like someone who'd already made up his mind to be brave even though everything in his body was screaming to run. He stopped 3 feet away and looked up. His eyes were brown and serious and filled with the kind of quiet desperation that made Ironwood's chest tighten. "Mister," the boy said softly, "are you somebody's dad?" Ironwood blinked. Of all the questions he'd expected, that wasn't one of them. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how his leather vest and tattooed arms must look to a child. "Not anymore," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The boy's face fell slightly, but he didn't back away. Instead, he held up the crumpled flyer. "There's a thing at my school tomorrow. A dads and donuts breakfast. They do it every year." Ironwood glanced at the flyer. Cartoon drawings of smiling fathers. And children decorated the edges, cheerful text announcing the event at Riverside Elementary School. "My foster mom said I could go," the boy continued quietly, "but I don't got a dad to bring. And if I show up alone, everyone's gonna know." Something heavy settled in Ironwood's stomach. He looked down at the kid, at the way his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself smaller, at the desperate hope flickering in his eyes. "Kid, I'm not," Ironwood started. "Just for one day." The boy interrupted, his voice cracking. "Just so I don't have to sit by myself. Please." And there it was. The question that would change everything. The question that would bring 200 bikers thundering into a small Arizona town. That would turn a simple school breakfast into something no one in Riverside would ever forget. Ironwood stood there in the desert heat, staring down at a boy he'd never met, and felt 15 years of walls beginning to crack. 20 minutes later, Ironwood sat across from the boy at a rest stop picnic table, The blue flyer spread between them while the kid explained his situation in a voice that tried hard not to sound like begging. His name was Daniel. He was 9 years old. He'd been in the foster system for 3 years, moving between 5 different homes after his mother died, and no other family could be found. His current placement was with a woman named Mrs. Alvarez who was kind enough, but worked 2 jobs and took care of 4 other foster kids, which meant Daniel spent most of his time trying not to be a problem. The breakfast is tomorrow at 8, Daniel said, tracing the edge of the flyer with one finger. It's only an hour. And there's donuts. Good ones, not the cheap kind. Ironwood watched the boy's face as he talked, seeing the careful way he constructed each sentence, like someone who'd learned that asking for too much meant getting nothing at all. It reminded him of someone. Reminded him of the daughter he'd barely known, the little girl who'd stopped asking when Daddy was coming home because the answer was always soon, and soon never came. Where's your school? Ironwood asked quietly. Daniel's head snapped up, hope flooding his features. Riverside. It's about 2 hours from here. I got a ride this far with Mrs. Alvarez's brother, but he had to keep going to Albuquerque. She's picking me up tomorrow on her way home from the night shift. You hitchhiked to a rest stop hoping to find a stranger to pretend to be your dad for a morning, Ironwood said slowly. Daniel's face flushed. I know it sounds weird, but I thought maybe a trucker or somebody would be nice. I didn't think anybody would actually stop, but then I saw you, and he stopped, suddenly uncertain. You look tough, like nobody would mess with you, and I thought maybe if you came with me, nobody would laugh. Ironwood felt something twist in his chest. The kid wasn't just afraid of being alone. He was afraid of being mocked for it. Why me? Ironwood asked. You could have asked any of those truckers. Daniel looked down at his hands. Because you look sad. Like you understand what it's like. The words hit harder than any punch Ironwood had taken in 20 years of bar fights and bad decisions. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, unsure what the hell he was supposed to do with that kind of honesty. He pulled out his phone and made a call. It rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. Yeah. Bear, Ironwood said. You near Flagstaff? About 30 miles out. What? How many of the chapter are in Arizona right now? There was a pause. Maybe 15, 20. What? Ironwood glanced at Daniel, who was watching him with barely contained hope. I need a favor. How do you feel about donuts? 6 hours later, Ironwood and Daniel pulled into Riverside just as the sun was setting, the boy riding on the back of the Harley with a borrowed helmet and a grip so tight Ironwood could feel it through his jacket. They stopped at a diner on Main Street, where Ironwood bought the kid a real meal while his phone buzzed with incoming messages. Bear had spread the word, not just to the local chapter, but across the entire Southwest network. By 9 that night, bikers were already rolling toward Riverside from Nevada, New Mexico, and Southern California. By midnight, the number had passed 50. Why are so many coming? Daniel asked, watching Ironwood read the messages. Ironwood looked at the boy for a long moment. Because sometimes brotherhood means showing up, even for someone you've never met. They spent the night in a motel on the edge of town, Daniel falling asleep almost immediately while Ironwood sat outside on the walkway, smoking a cigarette and watching headlights turn onto the highway. One by one, motorcycles began appearing, pulling into parking lots and side streets, their riders nodding to him in the darkness. By dawn, Riverside had been quietly invaded. When Ironwood woke Daniel at 7, the boy stumbled to the window and froze. The parking lot below was filled with motorcycles. Dozens of them. Leather-vested riders stood in small groups, drinking coffee from gas station cups, their breath misting in the cool morning air. How many? Daniel started. Enough, Ironwood said simply. They rode to Riverside Elementary in a convoy that stretched 3 blocks, engines rumbling in formation as the sun climbed above the desert hills. Parents arriving for the breakfast stopped and stared. Children pressed their faces against school windows. The principal stood in the parking lot with her mouth open. And Daniel, sitting behind Ironwood with his small arms wrapped around the massive biker's waist, couldn't stop smiling. The cafeteria at Riverside Elementary had been decorated with blue and yellow streamers, small tables arranged in neat rows, each set with paper plates and napkins printed with cartoon ties and mustaches. The room was designed to hold maybe 60 people comfortably. When Jackson Ironwood walked through the door with Daniel at his side, followed by a line of leather-vested bikers that seemed to have no end, the space transformed into something nobody had planned for. Principal Martinez recovered first. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of managing chaos. She approached Ironwood carefully, her eyes moving from his patches to the growing crowd of bikers filing in behind him. "Sir, I'm going to need to understand what's happening here," she said firmly. Ironwood placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. The boy needed someone to come to the breakfast with him. So he came. Martinez looked down at Daniel, recognition flickering across her face. She knew this child. Knew he'd been alone at every school event for the past year. Knew his teacher had quietly mentioned that Daniel had been talking about this breakfast for weeks, anxious about whether anyone would come. "All of you came for Daniel?" she asked softly. "Yes, ma'am," Ironwood replied. For a moment, Martinez said nothing. Then she nodded once. "We're going to need more donuts." What happened next would become legend in Riverside. Teachers scrambled to rearrange tables, pushing them together to create long rows. The PTA president made frantic calls to 3 different bakeries. Parents who'd been wary when the bikers first arrived began to see something different as the massive men carefully folded themselves into child-sized chairs, speaking quietly to kids who approached them with wide eyes and questions about motorcycles. Daniel sat beside Ironwood at the center table, his face glowing with something that looked like disbelief and joy mixed together. Other foster children in the school, kids who'd come alone or with overwhelmed caseworkers, suddenly found themselves sitting with bikers who asked about their favorite subjects and whether they liked chocolate or glazed donuts better. Bear, a 300-pound rider with arms like tree trunks and a gray beard that reached his chest, spent 20 minutes teaching a shy first grader how to draw a motorcycle. Another biker named Ghost, who had teardrops tattooed beneath his eye and hands scarred from decades of mechanical work, helped a little girl in pigtails tie her shoes when she got frustrated trying to do it herself. The principal stood in the doorway watching grown men who looked like they'd ridden straight out of an outlaw movie carefully, helping children open milk cartons and laughing when powdered sugar from donuts dusted their leather vests. Halfway through the breakfast, a local news crew appeared, having heard rumors about the massive biker presence at the elementary school. They expected to find a story about intimidation or disruption. Instead, their cameras captured something entirely different. Room full of children grinning beside bikers who'd driven hundreds of miles to make sure not a single kid felt alone. When the reporter tried to interview Ironwood, he shook his head. "Talk to the boy," he said simply. Daniel stood nervously in front of the camera, still clutching a half-eaten donut. "I just wanted somebody to come with me," he said quietly. And now everybody came. The reporter asked why it mattered so much. Daniel looked up at Ironwood, then back at the camera. "Because when you're alone all the time, you start thinking maybe you're supposed to be. But today I'm not alone. None of us are." The footage went viral before lunch. By afternoon, donations began flooding the school's foster support fund. By evening, 3 families had called about potential adoptions. And by the next morning, Mrs. Alvarez sat across from a social worker discussing something she'd been afraid to hope for: the possibility of adopting Daniel permanently. 2 weeks later, Ironwood returned to Riverside. He pulled his bike into the driveway of a small house with a chain-link fence and a basketball hoop missing its net. Daniel burst through the front door before Ironwood had even killed the engine, running across the yard with a paper clutched in his hand. "Look," the boy shouted, breathless. "Mrs. Alvarez is adopting me. It's really happening." Ironwood took the paper, seeing the official state letterhead, the legal terminology that meant Daniel would finally have a permanent home. He looked at the boy's face, at the pure joy radiating from someone who'd learned not to hope for too much. "That's good, kid," Ironwood said, his voice rough. "That's real good." Daniel threw his arms around Ironwood's waist, hugging him tightly. "Thank you for being my dad that day. Even though it was fake, it felt real." Ironwood crouched down so they were eye level. "Wasn't fake, Daniel. Brotherhood's real whether it's blood or choice. You needed family that day, so that's what we became." He reached into his vest and pulled out a small patch, black leather with white embroidery. It read, "Honorary Angel, Riverside Chapter. You ever need us again, you call. You're part of the family now." Daniel took the patch with trembling hands, clutching it like a treasure. As Ironwood rode away an hour later, the desert highway stretching endless before him, His phone buzzed with messages from brothers across 3 states checking in to see how the kid was doing. He thought about the daughter he'd lost, the father he'd failed to be when it mattered most. He couldn't change the past, couldn't bring back those lost years. But he could show up for a boy who needed someone, could turn one desperate question at a rest stop into a moment that reminded everyone, including himself, what family actually meant. Sometimes the hardest man in the room becomes the protector not in spite of his scars, but because of them. Because he remembers what it feels like to be alone, to be forgotten, to wonder if anyone would notice if he disappeared. And he decides that no kid on his watch will ever have to feel that way again.